warmly welcome everyone to this session where we're going to try to have a meeting of worlds, the ESG investor space and the security space. Before I start, I would like to ask you in the audience whether you are foremost experts on security or ESG investments. So, if you think, well, I'm more of an expert on security, please raise your hand. Okay, very good, thank you. And if you think, no, I'm actually much more of an expert on ESG investments, please raise your hand. Don't be shy, don't be... I have some, come on, hands, come on. There we go, very good, okay. So we have a strong group of experts on security and we have some who know ESG investments. Perfect. So my name is Sandra Adler. I'm a human rights lawyer by training. I have worked within business and human rights for, I guess you could say, 2 decades. First decade as a civil rights advocate working on human rights, and the second decade supporting companies on human rights due diligence across global value chains. I also currently sit on a technical expert group for an organization called EFRAG that has been tasked by the European Commission to develop standards by which companies have to report, disclose information on ESG, so European Sustainability Reporting Standards, specifying what is it that investors and others want to know about your impact on society, environment, and people. Okay, so I was selected in to be a social expert on that seat. And I guess this is kind of why the framing of today, why I was asked to moderate this session. But just 2 things that kind of puzzle me that I want to start off this panel with. So in the business and human rights realm, so there's this little space, business and human rights, where we try to analyze and understand companies' impact, right, on human rights. Everyone knows that providing security provides a high risk. It's almost even known before the guiding principles, the OECD guidelines. It's almost like pre-originates, like the Stone Age of business and human rights. We know this topic so well. Everyone understands complex market, conflict-sensitive areas, certain industries, high-risk security. On the other side, you have companies currently being compelled by due diligence legislation, by the legislation that I'm supporting to develop, the reporting directive from the EU, from country legislation, Germany, France, Norway, other countries are being asked to understand their value chains. So companies in their human rights due diligence are mapping out their entire value chains, from production to refinement to distribution, logistics, sales, use, end use, recycling, right? The whole life cycle. At the same time, in looking at that from the S perspective, we kind of often seem to be forgetting the S of the S, or the security of the social in corporate sustainability. And I'm puzzled as to why this is. Why is it that S kind of falls off? Why are we missing it when we know that it's such a high risk? The other thing that puzzles me, so I used to work a lot, and I still do, with human rights impact assessments of the extractive sector. So high-risk area, you find something out in the middle of nowhere. High-risk post-conflict areas, you need security to go out. So as an impact assessor, when we go out, we want to make sure that clients are going to keep us safe. So we ask, okay, how are you going to keep us safe in this very complex and high-risk area? And we often then get presented with the fantastic security force and firm that they will be working with, that they are working with. They know the area, they know the people, they know how to behave, they will protect us, they are our best friends, and we will keep them close. And then something happens. Something goes wrong. There is a clash with civil society. There is a presence of a trespasser. Something goes wrong, and too much violence or something happens, so there's a human rights exposure. Then the security, the same security that was supposed to keep us safe and that were our best friends, all of a sudden are our enemies. So it's a bit of a schizophrenic view on how we relate to security forces. And almost at no point, or at least with very few clients, do we take the perspective that actually the security guys are also people. They also have human rights. They are rights holders. I know I'm pulling the point a little bit here, but I just want to make the point. And I want to ask this panel today to help me unpack the questions that we're going to try to address now. So ICoCA has embarked on a project where we are going to have a work stream focusing on developing guidance for investors, trying to get ESG rating institutes to see private security contracting more as a part of global value chains. That is kind of the aim of where we want to go. And to unpack these topics, a little bit of these dilemmas that I have been outlining to you, a little bit of the thinking that I'm contemplating on, I have a fantastic panel that is going to try to help us unpack what are the risks pertaining to security and human rights. Is it that security firms are providing the risks, or how should we see the security firms? Secondly, is it true what I'm saying, that security is often dropped off, the S in the S, the security of the social? Is it true that investors fail to see it, or am I blindsided? And how can we improve? How can we move forward? How can we support ICoCA? How can we all move forward to see how we can get this better onto the supply chains of global firms and also onto the space of investors? Okay, I now would like to ask you once again. Do you think that investors and clients understand security and human rights? So I'm actually going to ask you to take 30 seconds and talk to the person sitting closest to you. So that's going to mean a stretch for some of you. But I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Say hello, your name, and do you think investors understand security and human rights? 30 seconds. Okay, I'm now going to interrupt you. I'm cutting your conversations. I'm very sorry. One more question. Don't leave your partner, your newfound friend. What, in your view, is the most forgotten perspective on human rights and security? What is the most forgotten perspective on human rights and security? Another 30 seconds. Go ahead. Yes. So the question was, what is the most forgotten perspective on security and human rights? What don't we talk so much about? What are we missing? A perspective, any? Okay, everyone. Thank you for warming up together with me. I think we are now ready for our panel, and to hear our panel add some perspectives to what you have started talking about. So thank you for sharing with each other. First out, we have James Lewry. James is the director of EMEA and ESG, and there we go, two abbreviations. I'll let you unpack the EMEA one yourself in case I get one of them wrong. ESG, sustainable business, control risk. James, you're going to talk to us a little bit from the private security industry perspective and unpack for us a little bit what you think are the risks associated with private security contracting. Please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sandra. So as Sandra says, I am a director with Control Risks. My background actually is in security. It's been that background my whole working life. So I do feel at home here at ICoCA. But my day job is as a specialist in human rights and social risks in supply chain. So I support clients doing due diligence, mapping across their international supply chains to identify the sorts of issues that we're talking about today. So I hope that I offer two perspectives, one from working for a company that provides security services in high-risk environments, but also as someone that acts on behalf of clients and investors to look at these issues in global supply chains. And I suppose in answer to the question and to the point, I think there's probably three things that I would say around the risks, if you like, from private security around human rights. And some are obvious, some are not perhaps so obvious. But I think in explaining that and unpacking it, it's useful to think about private security as agents of human rights impacts. And we're all familiar, I know, about the stories of where we're agents of those impacts. I think, though, what's often overlooked is how private security personnel can also be subjects of human rights abuses as well. So we have a duty of care as employers to our personnel, and we often put them into situations which puts them in harm's way and requires them to make choices, often in the spur of the moment, about key issues that affect our own brand as security companies, as much as it does place them in those situations. But finally, I would invite, I guess, people to think about, as you said, with the human rights due diligence legislation, and thinking particularly about the various European acts, how private security has an opportunity, particularly through ICoCA membership, in fact, of getting ahead of the curve when it comes to clients doing due diligence on the companies in this room, but also as we are all part of a supply chain, then we've certainly seen increased due diligence as well. So thinking about the impacts then as private security companies being agents of human rights abuses, I think that there are some obvious case studies that I'm sure we're all familiar with, but I was struck by what I heard from the panel previously around the sports sector, and particularly the Qatar World Cup at the moment, which is going on. And I know one of the panelists gave an example of how security is being used at the World Cup. But it struck me actually that we've got people there, security officers, carrying out instructions on behalf of FIFA, behalf of the Supreme Committee in Qatar, who are being asked on a daily basis to enforce certain conditions, particularly around, as the speaker said, around LGBTQ plus issues. But those same companies that employ those officers have got policies which conflict with what they're being asked to do on the ground. Now, if you step out of a fairly benign environment like that into something like a mining site in the DRC or a post-conflict state, obviously you're having the same choices, and security officers are making those fundamental choices on the ground, but you run the risk there of much more severe human rights abuses as a result, where those personnel lack agency, perhaps. They lack authority on the ground. Those decision-making processes aren't quite there. So the governance, essentially, isn't in place. So that's certainly a source of risk. I think the other one, turning to security officers and personnel as subjects of human rights abuses, this is the one which I think is often overlooked, particularly by the investors that we work with in terms of thinking about risks from the private security industry. And I guess an example of that is through our work mapping supply chains, meeting with rights holders. We meet with security guards across the world, and the conditions that security guards are kept in and subject to really is worse in some cases than the very rights holders that we're there to meet and interview. And I'm talking about, bonded labour, forced labour conditions, passport retentions, working hours, where often security is outside of the norms of other parts of the labour law, for example. So I think it's important to think about security as rights holders. But I did say about opportunity as well. So in terms of opportunity, I think all of us in this room are really well placed when it comes to those human rights due diligence laws, because we're doing a lot of the good practices through the Code of Conduct anyway, but perhaps we're not talking about it enough, or talking about it in the right way. So I think for me that would be a definite point which could be improved. And a nice example of that is we're all employers. And I think, if I think of our own case, we have quite a number of personnel in Iraq. And through working with those people who are part of the local community there, the employment opportunities that we've created and you all create, the opportunity for lifelong learning, the development and lifting out of the socio-economic backgrounds that we find often our personnel in, I think there's a really good story to tell, and something that does chime, I know, with some of the investors that we talk to who are looking for ways to have positive and meaningful impact in their investments. So those are the three areas, I think, which speak to the risks that private security faces, but the opportunity as well.
Thank you, James. I think that's a really good summary and three perspectives that ends off with the opportunities, which I think is a good one. So maybe just to prompt you a little bit more on that. So which steps could security firms themselves, but also buyers of security firms, take to mitigate these risks and to shift our perspective to the opportunities?
Yeah, I think, there's some obvious ones, and as we're at an ICoCA event, obviously follow the code. It absolutely talks to those key aspects of risk management that are so essential to managing these issues. But there's two perhaps areas which I would say specifically. I think if you look at how investors have acted recently, there's been some high-profile cases of divestments in security companies that have failed to show progress on human rights issues. That's not to say those companies weren't doing anything about those issues, but the communication of that and the remedy and solutions weren't as well, I think, followed through and progressed. So I think for me it's remedy, making sure that is front and centre of any issues that are identified. And then the second one, and going back to the due diligence point, I think due diligence is super healthy for us in this room, and I would encourage it. We want our clients that we bid on contracts against. We want those competitors to be judged against us. We've got strict due diligence processes, or risk management processes rather. We want to shout about that. We want to talk about it. And as ICoCA members, I think you've got, as I say, a good story to tell. So I think due diligence can be super positive in shining a spotlight on this industry, which I think in your discussions you would probably have come to the conclusion, I hope, that more could be done to put this on the investor agenda. So certainly due diligence, embrace it, and talk about it and the steps that you're taking.
Thank you so much, James, for shining light on those perspectives. Thank you. So now we're going to jump over to the other side of the fence, I was going to say, but I mean the other world, the other topic. So Christian Leitz, Head Corporate Responsibility, UBS. You are now tasked with the small task of speaking from the investor perspective. The S in the ESG and the security and the social. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the invite. I believe the invitation that I got invited is because I have sort of a number of touch points to the topic. I am actually not part of our asset management, so you're not speaking to somebody who does deal with investments directly. But I am, responsible, for instance, for the sustainability report of the bank. I built the entire NGO monitoring and communication system for the bank, and I suppose Philipp can then relate to that one later on. So we do all the interactions with all the activists and the ESG investors that are invested in UBS, and the ratings that are looking at UBS, so as a bank. I'm a secretary of Board of Directors Committee, chaired by our chairman, on all of those topics and more, so I suppose that angle is also relevant, and I'm responsible for the code of conduct of the bank, among a few other things. Now, maybe following on from a question that Sandra put, and I could honestly not find the empirical evidence, so we probably need what the world usually is interested in, the anecdotal evidence. I'm a historian, I like empirical evidence, but thankfully, we have a room of people that can provide anecdotal evidence. Those of you who sort of responded that you are in security, the companies that you work for, put your hand up if the company is listed on a stock market. Ouch. Okay, well, there you've already got one answer without me adding anything else. I've always been astounded, when I had these interactions with non-governmental organizations, and they would be very concerned that UBS, when we had a larger investment bank than we have today, is supporting IPOs. And I always said to NGOs, you should be very keen on IPOs, because IPOs,
abbreviations.
Sorry, initial public offerings. So getting a company onto the stock market, because essentially that would increase the level of transparency automatically. I'll give you one example. One very large mining company in Switzerland was listed, and the next day there was the very first time that the CEO of that company gave a huge interview, of all places, in 20 minutes, in 20 minutes or whatever it's called, which I found very astounding. But that's a telling example of you list, you're on the stock market, and the situation changes and the scrutiny changes. So that may be my first point. The second one is, just to give you a few examples, pipelines. Let's take pipelines, because we had, as banks, a few interesting examples in the past about pipelines. What I find interesting, and maybe that's an answer going into a different direction, is that for many, many years, and actually you could take a power station too, and you can take a mine, you can take any example. When we got scrutinized by critics, NGOs, and so on, they would come to us, as a bank, and I always wondered why they wouldn't go to the insurance companies, after all, without insurance, it's a bit difficult to do a project like that, and why they never go to the companies that supply water, electricity to those very projects, because without water or electricity, it's a bit difficult to do the project either. So the answer here is, of course, sometimes this stuff is pretty selective, and in terms of the public attention you get as a critic, you probably choose those that already get public attention, and not the others that are not really well known, So maybe that's my second point in terms of an answer. The third one actually is, it should really be, and I now say GGES, governance, 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 and then you can have your E&S. I think the whole thing is the wrong way round, because if you don't have the right governance in place, who cares about E&S? I mean, you can tell me as much as you like about climate and whatever you do in human rights. If you can't answer the one question, which is, does your board care? And the second question, does your executive board care? And the third question, do you have a governance around it? And the fourth question, do you have a risk management around it? You already have a problem, you know. Then you can tell me anything you like about human rights. I probably won't believe you, you know, because you already lost the game there. So I think that's why it's not surprising that if you look at something like the task force, and I do use the long term now, TCFD is a lot easier, but task force for climate-related financial disclosures. By the way, there is now TNFD, which is the task force for nature-related financial disclosures, which, by the way, is also telling, because that's all E. There is not anything on S. You know, I mean, I had a conversation recently, just an aside, with the UK Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and she'd love to have that, you know, for a topic like that, but there isn't. But when you look at the TCFD or the TNFD, what comes first? Well, surprise, surprise, governance. What comes second? Strategy. What comes third? Risk management. And then we're into the discussions, of course, that James was referring to. And by the way, also metrics and targets. So do try and make this stuff quantifiable, you know, with some objectives to it. But the point being is that without that first one, without the G, it's pretty difficult to get to the S, you know. And actually, there is another point here, maybe my last point on this. What the G connected to the S, the strategy, not the S social, actually does is that a company really looks very carefully at what is actually material to that company. So maybe human rights is not the most material one, you know, because you may be mostly engaged in low-risk areas, you know. So maybe it's something else, you know. Maybe it's a specific other topic, you know. But I think, again, you know, you can only understand that as a company if you start at that G and S as strategy level to really consider the ins and outs of that. And then, of course, you know, you need to look at exactly what James highlighted. What does that mean for your processes, due diligence, and so on? But still, I think we should not start with the S, even though I'm now contradicting the whole purpose of this session.
Christian, thank you. I don't think you're contradicting it. I think you're emphasizing the importance for governance for this issue. So thank you for raising that. If I could just ask you one question. So what do you think then? Like how, I mean, as a former civil society representative, I kind of think like, well, yeah, process and governance, you can build that forever, but we want to see difference on the ground. And I know that's what you're ultimately trying to set the goals for. But what do we need then to get investors more engaged? Is it what would you say is needed?
I think one of the points, of course, was that, you know, if you are listed, then of course there is a different attention. But then I put that to the side. You know, I think at the moment, very clearly, and we talked about this briefly just before, an investor would really look at the sector. So they would look at mining and not at private security. And then the focus is mining. And then all the questions would largely go to the mining company, you know, about it, you know, its own employees, you know, private security, whatever, you know. So anything to do with a particular sector is in the foreground, you know. So in a sense, in inverted commas, strong inverted commas, private security is just then an addendum to the main focus of the investor, which is the company in question that really, you know, is the one that has the private security company as a supplier, whatever you want to call it, you know. Which actually takes me to a second important point, and of course we see that already now, and that is when the whole area of due diligence is increasingly regulated. And I mentioned modern slavery acts, UK, Australia. By the way, that's also pretty telling, you know. I mean, everybody seems to have a different view on what to focus on when it comes to human rights, you know. I mean, Switzerland is child labor and conflict minerals, the UK is modern slavery, Australia is modern slavery, France is loi de vigilance, you know, the Japanese, I think, are now looking also probably at child labor, or the Finnish, I can't remember, but it's really kind of all over the place, you know. With climate, you just have climate. Sorry, I mean, everybody is looking at the TCFD and it's climate. And so the regulation that, and I think one of the interesting examples here is, for instance, the German Supply Chain Act, because there the emphasis on supply chain. And I think that, of course, this kind of regulatory scrutiny, investors don't like liabilities. If you fall foul of the law, they don't like that because it usually costs money. So, of course, the more things are regulated in this respect, you know, then there will also be more attention. But then I go kind of roundabouts. If you're not listed, you may not get that attention, you know.
Thank you, Christian. So In fact, yes, we're now going all the way to the end. Not to the end, but to the end of the of the circle. We now touched a little bit in your address, Christian, about the need to make informed decisions, and we're very happy that we have Dr. Philipp Aeby, CEO, Chief Executive Officer for RepRisk, who is going to share a little bit of light to data. Without data, we can't really do much, can we, in terms of asking questions? We need data to really see what the problems are and to monitor progress. Philipp, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. So I'm here on this panel because I'm a ESG data provider employee, and I'm therefore a specialist on the ESG industry. And I would like to share some insights and give you some insights also into the inner workings of the ESG industry, because it's a very immature industry and just got basically to the prominence for the last 2 or 3 years. And actually, I can already give you my conclusion. I would wonder whether you really want to go these whole ESG things, or whether there's maybe some other ways where you can actually pursue more successful interactions with your buyers, with your clients, instead of focusing on ESG data providers and rating companies. But anyway, so you have to imagine I'm sitting here on the fence, because I'm in between the security providers and the asset managers, because we provide data to the asset managers for them to take a decision whether they want to invest in a company. And here I would like to repeat what Christian already said. The answer, of course, why most investors have no clue about security companies and all the surrounding issues, some of them human rights, is because usually they don't invest in security companies, but they invest, for example, as also was said before, in a commodity trade or extractive industries mining company. And then, however, there's an interesting game potentially going on, and this is that if you, as a non-governmental organization, let's say Greenpeace, am I allowed to mention names of NGOs? I did it already. Greenpeace is an environmental NGO, a pretty activist NGO. And they're not really interested in control risk, I'm afraid. But what they love to do is basically to connect something bad to the company you just indirectly mentioned, this Swiss commodity company that is listed in the UK. So who could that be? And everyone knows, and they used to be very secretive, and they had a sort of bad reputation. So if you can now link something happening that is done by a security company somewhere in Congo to this company, that's a win for an NGO, because then they can push the point. Well, actually, it's a bad example because Greenpeace does environmental stuff. Let's take Human Rights Watch. Then you can push a point that you want something to happen because it gets a lot of attention. So the way to get attention is you attack a big company, because this gets attention, and this company is usually listed, and this is where the investors get interested. So that's the mechanism, basically how that usually works out, but also explains why investors and data providers like me know very, very little about security companies, because we're not directly dealing with security or with security companies. But I said, I'm the ESG expert, so maybe I should first say something about ESG. I'm not even sure what it stands for. Does it say environmental, social, governmental, or does it stand for environmental, social governance? I think no one knows. But the one thing you must understand, and take this home, if you remember one thing from the session, you must know that ESG was invented in Switzerland. Like the cheese, like the World Wide Web, we Swiss actually invented ESG. And last time I was in Geneva, I bumped into a British guy who claimed that he invented it. Don't believe him. I mean, did the British invent the cheese? You see. Okay, but the truth is, I on the train here from Zurich, I tried to find out actually where this ESG really comes from, because for me it's super convenient. Now I can say I work for an ESG data provider. Well, in 2006, when we actually started our due diligence service, actually originally for UBS, a due diligence service on human rights, on pollution, on corruption. I didn't know what I shall say when I was asked by my friends what I'm doing. Then I said, well, I do things like intelligence on business conduct, or I just mentioned the issues, as I said, like human rights. Now I can say I work for an ESG company, and everyone thinks I'm super cool because ESG is hot. Okay, the story here is basically that we talk about issues that have been here for a long, long time. Human rights, for example. I can say certainly my parents cared about human rights. I mentioned Congo before. The problem is, how did my parents know what's going on from our point of view here in Switzerland is a remote place, right? For me, it's a remote place. I've never been to any of the two Congos. So basically, my parents cared about human rights, but they did nothing about that. And this is what has changed in the meantime. And that's what you have to take into account. Transparency has been increasing. So basically, the big thing that has happened is because there's transparency on what companies are doing. From a Swiss point of view, what is a remote place or whatever you live, if you live in Congo, you can find out what's happening in India. Because transparency is increasing, these topics have all of a sudden become very, very important. So if you do due diligence, so the company I work for, RepRisk, doesn't stand abbreviation, doesn't stand for reproduction risk or something, it stands for reputational risk. And why is a company called reputational risk? Because when we started in 2006, the investors and the banks, but also the multinationals, were mainly concerned about a reputational adverse impact. So if someone associated human rights incidents with the company, then the CEO or the general counsel or the chairperson basically has to justify what happened. So they try to avoid such troubles, and they do that by basically getting as much transparency as possible regarding their investments, regarding their suppliers, and here we are with the security companies. Or wait a second, I said clients, suppliers, or any investments they do. So let me come back. Remember, ESG is a Swiss invention. We don't need to know what it stands for, but it has something to do with non-financial risks, as it was called before. This famous report came out in 2004 by the ESG. And it matters because there's a lot of transparency nowadays. Whatever happens in different places of the world, it can get attention. And usually, example Qatar, it gets attention because of something else. It's not necessarily, I don't know, that so many human rights, security relations incidents are happening in Qatar in comparison to other countries, but most people know that there's actually this FIFA World Cup going on, so there's a lot of attention to this. So, again, so these issues are here. They get important because of transparency. Investors don't really care about security companies because they don't invest in them and have no clue about that. But the security companies have to deal with that because of the transparency that nowadays around, and any NGO, any report, all of a sudden can hit them, and then they have to justify what they have to do.
Thank you, Philipp. So you work with data and indicators. Do we have good indicators to measure security and human rights?
Of course, the short answer is no. But about the ESG industry that I said before, that is a little bit immature, and us included, I have to say just actually two more things. So basically in ESG, you can get data from what companies report, and the whole effort, for example, by the European Union is all about self-reporting. So as of a certain size, you have to report what you do on these environmental, social, governance things. That's one source of information. When it comes to human rights, this is not a very useful source of information, because if you have any problem, we don't report that. You know, it's the same like if you have a corruption problem, do you really report that in your sustainability report? Probably not. So the reporting is a good thing when it comes to environmental footprint or maybe a diversity, such questions, but not when it comes to the S in ESG and human rights. So there's another source of information, and I alluded to that somehow before, and this is whatever actually is reported by sources from outside the companies. And I mentioned non-governmental organizations, but there are a lot of government organizations. For example, in China alone, there are 4,200 environmental protection agencies at the local, province, and state level. The media, etc., the social media, etc. So the interesting data for investors and buyers, etc., in my point of view, and that's our business, of course, with machine learning and a lot of super fancy stuff, are actually information from outside of companies. And this is there's a lot of really actionable information on human rights and security. And that's also, for example, this one prominent case for a security company that actually got excluded by the Norwegian pension fund, the world's largest asset owner and a client of ours, that actually found that there are allegations regarding human rights, and then actually started, based on due diligence, an investigation of that. So the data are here from outside.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that, and also the importance of external representation.
She got really nervous that I don't stop work talking.
Won't have time to talk. Pranoti, Surve Senior Manager, Global Security Programs, Philip Morris International. We've now gone a little bit from the security side to the ESG realm to data, and now we're giving the floor to hear again a little bit of the company perspective. So integrating human rights respect into security practices, it's kind of what everyone is alluding to needs to happen, right? So you have to do the job. So a continuous journey of learnings, that's kind of what I capture from your rich experience. Please.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Look, I think the first and most important thing that I'll say is that we don't have to do this. Nobody's asking us. So there is zero accountability, right? So let's start there. Nobody's demanding from any company that we deliver human rights and security services, right? And let me ask you all this question. This event today is part of the knowledge economy. We're all going to take away something hopefully valuable from this event, right? How many of you noticed whether or not there are security personnel at the door when you walked in? Did you notice? Is there a camera? Is there a person watching the camera? Is there a guy at the door? A woman at the door? No? Anybody? Anybody? No. Exactly. There's a camera, there's an access control system with a physical key lock, and there's a person in a little control room behind the door to the left when you enter, right? Now, this is where the problem starts. We don't notice security professionals in our midst, right? We don't notice the security guards who are manning our facilities, and it may be benign in a location like this. If you go to a more higher perceived risk location, you may start to see more visible security personnel, perhaps in uniforms, sometimes not in uniforms, but we don't notice security personnel, right? So I think therein lies the first problem, is that we're dehumanizing the people who are responsible for the delivery of security services, right? So let's start with the fact that these individuals, security guards who are at the front line, of delivering security services. So step one in the value chain is not me as the client of the security services. Step one in the value chain of the delivery of security services is the security guard, right? So working conditions for the security guard, fair pay for the security guard, number of working hours that they're permitted to work. A lot of these are unregulated in a number of different countries. There are no restrictions on the maximum number of working hours that a security guard can work in very many countries. There are countries where security guards are capable and are working between 60 and 100 hours a week, sometimes more, sometimes with arms on site, right? Firearms on site, with batons, with the ability to, use excessive force in a situation like this where their judgment might be compromised. Because guess what? This person has been on duty for 24, 48 hours maybe at a stretch, right? So what we did as I think our first step, and really this was part of, I think, PMI's renewed commitment to human rights, right? This is where to Christian's, Philip Morris's commitment to human rights. And this is to your point, Christian, from earlier on, about where does the accountability sit in your organization, right? From a client perspective, our accountability sits with our executive board, sits with our board, and trickles all the way down to the last mile in our supply chain and our value chain, right? And what do we mean by this? We started our work with ICoCA, I want to say about 4 years ago in earnest, where we started to transform the way we deliver security services in our value chain. We require every single security service provider in our value chain to be a member of ICoCA, to train every single security guard who is deployed at our site in fundamental appropriate use of force, appropriate behaviors that are required. We have this requirement laid out in our contracts with all of our security service providers, which is not something that I believe is common practice in our industry, right? When you work in the security sector, I don't know how many private sector security service providers are represented here, but I have not heard yet of another instance where the requirement to uphold human rights practice, membership of an international organization that works in the private sector security human rights space, and holding people accountable, holding security service providers accountable to a minimum standard of training for our security guards is not common practice. And this is, again, comes back to the question around accountability. Who is asking? Nobody's asking, therefore nobody's solving for these problems, right? I think the final piece that I'd like to touch on is actually working conditions for these security guards, right? And I think somebody mentioned earlier on that, when you see a security personnel in a uniform, it strikes fear sometimes, right, in people, and there's a respect for authority for the uniform, even if it's not for the individual themselves, it's for the uniform, right? But on the flip side of that, that individual may have been at work for I don't know how many hours on the shift, in possession of a firearm that they may be trained or licensed to use the firearm, perhaps, depending on the country, perhaps licensed to use the firearm, but not trained in the appropriate use of force in that situation, right? Probably paid minimum wage. And I'd like to give you an example because I know we referenced anecdotes before. I'd like to give you an example. In one of the countries where we transitioned to the integration of human rights in our security services, we became aware that the security guards were working on average between 60 and 100 hours a week at minimum, right? Now, they were being paid at X number of dollars per hour to work for those 60 or 100 hours. Now, if I enforce a minimum requirement to a maximum requirement of cutting off the number of working hours to 40 hours a week, and they continue to be paid at that minimum wage, what happens to that person's living? Are they making a living wage anymore? Is the security guard making minimum living wage? They're not, right? So as the client, I have to put my money where my mouth is, and also say that, look, we're going to revise the number of working hours to 40 hours a week, but your wage per hour will be adjusted to well above the minimum in the country that you're operating in, so that you make a sustainable living wage, right? Again, who is asking for any of these things to be reported? Absolutely nobody, right? And I think one of the things that we've done differently is to start to make these contractual obligations, start to make these things that we report and track against, have actual metrics that we track as a security team, but that we also report upwards to our board, and that we also report outside our organization. So I will pause there, Sandra.
Thank you, Pranoti. Letting the translators finish. So from your very long and rich experience from doing this, and I think it's very motivating to hear, without anyone asking, you've decided that you want to do this. What would you say are the success factors? You came a little bit to that in the end. You mentioned contracts, you mentioned reporting upwards, tracking performance. What are some of your expensively, paid for lessons learned, your success factors that you could pass on to others?
So I've been fortunate in my career. I don't have any expensive human rights mistakes on my record yet, but there's a few years ahead still. But I think a few things that we've learned that I'm happy to share is actually to integrate your security service practice into your human rights impact assessments? Why would you not have a section of your human rights impact assessments covering off the delivery of security services? We partner closely with Philip Morris's human rights practice to actually involve the external agencies that conduct our impact assessments to also cover off a pretty comprehensive section on the delivery of security services, right? This should not be an afterthought that comes from the impact assessment agency. It is something that we proactively ask for. We want our security services to be tested against a high standard of human rights in the countries that we operate in. We also ask for it to be reciprocal, so not just the impact assessment agency testing the security service provider and us on the ground, but also understanding whether the service provider's staff, the service provider's employees are treated fairly, are treated appropriately, are trained to the standard that we expect them to be trained at. Right? This is, I think, fundamental. The second thing that we've done is measurement and monitoring. Right? It's not enough to just say, I've put it in the contract, now it's set and forget, or I have a partnership with ICoCA, it's set and forget. You know, I require my security service provider to be a member of ICoCA, it's set and forget. Absolutely not. There's consistent measurement and monitoring. We have KPIs that are human rights specific that we track on a monthly basis across all of the countries that we operate in. We have KPIs that are labor specific, right? So to ensure that our security service providers are not working over a certain number of hours on a weekly, monthly, annual basis, that are tracked and reported across the globe in all of the countries that we operate in. We have a very strict governance model in place where we have, you know, a monthly and a quarterly check-in routine with all of our security service providers. And I think the most important thing is taking the partnership approach. We didn't come at this with, you know, dictating to our security service providers wherever they may be in the world, right? Nobody likes to be dictated to, but also this is not, you know, a model that's sustainable. I can dictate to a company that for this 3-year contract that you have with me, I would like you to believe and uphold all of these human rights. But that's not something that will become a practicable model once we've ended that partnership, right? So what we wanted to do, and we had a number of challenging countries, right? Particularly, you know, countries where the human rights discourse is seen as something that's dictated by the global north to the global south. This is something that tends to become a little bit of a harder conversation.
Thank you so much, Pranoti. Thank you. And last but not least in our panel, we have Elora Wilbur, who is an executive manager at People and Organization at PwC Switzerland. You have been advising and supporting companies to integrate ESG for a long time, you and your department. And you will speak a little bit to us about your experiences from how to close the gap between policy and practice. So integrating ESG across companies, sectors, warmly welcome.
Thank you, Sandra. And welcome, everyone. I hope you are still awake. So we will continue on. And I had the fortune to follow all of these great speakers and kind of build up my own speech after you. So thank you very much. What I'd like to talk about today is really sort of the people in ESG, and I don't want to necessarily pinhole it and talk about the S only, because I think people underpin all of those different elements to a certain degree. And so what I really want to talk about is what we are seeing with our clients, with our different company interactions. What are the trends that we are seeing? And of course, at the end of the day, what is really the voice of the people that we are trying to support and be there for? What are companies really thinking about in terms of people? And so thinking about that voice, I think there are a couple of different ways that you can look at this. So from one perspective, you can look at it from the idea of, for example, James mentioned the security agents. So thinking about, and Pranoti as well, talking about all of the different security providers. Thinking about this, one of the things that we are seeing at our clients quite often is the question about, okay, we would like to change our culture, change the behavior of our organization. And part of that is understanding the voice of the people in the organization, naturally. And one of the things would be quite important that we see and is working well across many different organizations and companies is to actually bring those voices into the room. So we are all here coming from a variety of different experiences. But as you mentioned, Pranoti, for the person outside of the door, what is their perspective? What are they really thinking about this conversation that we are having? And not to make assumptions about what we think we should do or what we should communicate to investors or what kind of data is important to bring into that sustainability report, for example. I take a pause, give them some time. So what I would like to also mention as well is thinking about diversity and inclusion is a hot topic. This is something that is mentioned quite often in conversations about ESG, environment, social governance. Let's try that. So with diversity and inclusion, the question is kind of what direction would you like to go as an organization or as a company or as a government? Is there a direction that you would like to let's say, follow the trends that we are seeing across our clients in terms of bringing in that voice of, let's say, women? This is quite a hot topic that we see in terms of, do we have women on the leadership boards? Do we have women in leadership positions? I think I just saw a statistic recently that from the World Economic Forum that there are 31% globally in terms of, there are 31% of global leadership positions are filled by women. So this is one way to look at that voice. And this is important. And what we are doing with our clients, we are also looking at things like helping them to get certified on equal salary topics or have, let's say, leadership inclusivity training, things like this. In addition, however, this is one element of a D&I or diversity and inclusion conversation. And that's one way that you can go to kind of match the trends that we've been seeing over the last at least 20 years on the topic of ESG and D&I. I hope I've clarified those enough times by now. So on the other hand, what you can do is also see what is it that you would like to leave behind as a legacy. So there's a lot of different representation in the room today. What is it that you are going to do? So that's the question I pose to you all. I'm sure you think about it every day. And the reason why I pose that question is, do you want to follow the trend of let's bring in more women, let's talk about security? I'm not a security expert, but let's talk about security from a slightly different paradigm or different lens. That's really good. Or also, would you like to go down the realm of, down the path of considering, can you bring the investors to you? Can you lead the conversation? Can you create such a stimulating narrative that it's not just about diversity and inclusion, about women or about the voice of a particular type of security agent, but it's about, or let's say actually about women, and then I can clarify the idea that it's about bringing in more than just that particular voice, which is a trend right now, but bringing in all the voices. So to the topic of security agents, I'm sure we can see globally this is quite a few who are male, who would identify as male, for example. And it's also important to bring in their voices when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and we talk about bridging that gap in terms of how are we communicating with our policies and practice with ESG. So to clarify those two, just to make it very, very brief and to the point, one is you can do one aspect, and we are seeing this in a lot of our clients progressively more, that are getting on the train of let's be more diverse and inclusive and talk about our culture and our behaviors and follow the trends of what we're seeing with particularly women, for example. Or you can be a voice to bring those investors, bring the conversation to you in terms of, let's say, broadening the paradigm of the voice, coming back to the beginning, broadening the paradigm of the voice that you are including in your communications with investors, with your people, and trying to change your organization or your company.
Thank you, Elora. That's very thought-provoking, I think, from a variety of perspectives. So, I mean, that sounds great. And if you have a willing organization that wants to go that extra mile, that's great, right? But how could you incentivize an organization to do more of that? If you have for example, a compliance-driven organization where, like Pranoti said, no one is really asking you to look at security. How could you bring security to the forefront of considerations?
It's a really good question, Sandra. So I think what's important to consider here is the conversation is not new, as you were mentioning, Philipp. The conversation is not new about the benefits or the return that you get for bringing in different voices, let's say. And so just to really get back to your question, how do you incentivize? I think the incentive is already there. It's just a matter of bringing that conversation to the table and saying, okay, yes, we are considering, let's say, women, but we are also considering men. We're also considering others in the conversation. And I think what we see, just to be anecdotal, as you mentioned, a story that I have, we're working with a particular agency that has a protection component to what they are doing. And what we heard was a very large disparity of the voice of the people between the headquarters and the field, so to speak. And so people in the field were saying, what you are asking us to do, we would willingly do if you could include our voice in what you're asking us to do.
Thank you. That's a really nice way to round that off. Thank you. Wow, that's a lot to think about. I would now like to ask you for another reflection, maybe turn around in the other direction and meet someone you haven't met before and say, what is on your mind right now? Is there something that Laura said now? How do you speak with people you don't see? Voices, or is it about the problems, agents, and seeing them as human beings, as security providers they are also rights holders. What is on your mind right now? Let's take 1 minute. Meet someone you haven't met before. Yeah, right. It's a very, yeah. everyone. So now I'm interrupting you again. Time for me to interrupt you. Hello and welcome back. I am happy that you are having such intense conversations. That's fantastic. You know, you also have a very long lunch to continue conversations. I'm very happy about that. So let's see if there are any questions for the panel. I think we might have a microphone somewhere, and someone who might be able to help with sharing the microphone. So any questions that you would like to ask? Yes, in the middle we have and please try to do what we have not done at the panel, speak slowly. Sorry to the translators. Please share who you are.
Hi, it's Edward Martin from Henderson Risk Limited in the UK.
Sorry, where?
Henderson Risk Limited in the UK.
Okay.
We've seen a lot of consumer focus recently on the benefit corporation or B Corp concept. And I think it's relevant to both sides of the panel. How much do you value this? Do you see it as something positive? Is it more greenwash, social wash? Because I certainly see it becoming more and more recognizable in media and discourse.
Thank you. I think we're going to take a few questions and then we're going to let the panel respond. That's a really good question. Thank you so much for raising that. More questions? Yes, please. We have a hand here making you run around. Sorry. So please, your name and where you're from.
Hello, Michael Meyer from the Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations here in Geneva, and in particular responsible for the business and human rights file. I would like to come back to the last element that was mentioned by the representative of on the left side on measurement and indicators of ESG. And well, we had this very critical article in The Economist now a couple of months ago, and which concluded essentially that the measurement does not properly work, so maybe we should concentrate just on the E. My question to you would be, what are the consequences of just these critics? Do we either go in the direction that actually, yes, banks or asset managers concentrate on the E, and therefore leave out more of our preoccupations on the S and the G, or actually are we increasing our efforts on the criteria and there are more efforts on this side? Maybe actually the representative of UBS can also respond to this question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a big question. Thank you. More reflections. Yes, please.
Thank you. Tobias Suttner from PwC here in Switzerland. And one of the questions that is coming up here is how can we help investors to focus more and to take more into consideration ESG? The reason why I'm asking the question is whenever we talk to our clients in our M&A departments, but as ESG is really important. It's really important to us. However, we don't have any measures to compare, which means that if we actually focus on ESG and we bring it into our decision, we're missing out on opportunities when we buy some other companies. So maybe you can share your thoughts of what you think we can do more of to bring ESG higher up the list and the investment decisions.
Thank you. Let's see if we have one more question. Yes, in the middle we have one more question.
Sorry, Liam Kelly from G4S Risk Management. Pranoti, I applaud the approach that your organisation has taken in regards to security, because for a security provider to operate professionally and look after its staff and be ethical throughout its approaches, that comes at a cost. And I'd just like to understand more how you were able to secure a much larger security budget and how you got the buy-in from your executive committee.
Everyone needs a Pranoti, I think. Okay. Anyone? Oh, sorry. Great. In the shades. Getting a good exercise here, running around with the microphone.
Hi, my name is Paula Duprat-de-Bias. I'm a journalist here in Geneva. Given the fact that ESG is such a fluid concept, and that, as you have rightly stated, it's the sort of self-monitoring and self-regulation of it has worked sort of in a very fluid manner. How is it that all of you see the human rights being regulated? I mean, there's, I'd like to hear that from all of you, both, coming from the business side or, corporate side, as well as security.
Thank you. I think it's also a very valid question. And last question, almost last here. And then we'll try to round off with comments from the panel.
I'm Hans-Peter Heinrich from Sustainable, Geneva-based consultancy. And basically, in all these measurement things, what I see really is the danger is about ticking the box. Basically, we ticked all the boxes, but does it make a difference on the ground? And the one question I have is how you actually make sure there's a difference, a change on the ground. Because also with our clients, we see they very much follow this tick the box approach. However, when it comes to impact on the grounds, nobody is ready to go the next step. And I would ask you guys this question: how can you make sure there's actually also impact and changes on the ground?
Thank you. Wow, these are really wise questions from all of you, really ranging across the board here. So now my challenge is going to be to keep this group brief, and who's going to answer what. Okay. So yeah, I think we have questions for everyone. So I'm going to give you 1 minute each, maybe 1.5, to respond to the ones you thought might relate to you. I can see there was quite a lot for you, Philipp. But yeah, should we start with you, Philipp? You got some questions about greenwashing, about indicators, about self-proclamation that you might want to reflect on.
But the one I want to start with was with The Economist, right? So The Economist said, ESG is not getting us anywhere. ESG ratings, that's how you measure things, don't work. And let's do something meaningful and just focus on climate. Well, they called it E for environment, but basically climate. So in my view, I think I agree with this analysis, but I don't agree with the conclusion. So first of all, the ESG ratings. What is the problem? The problem with them is that they're not meaningful, because what one famous academic paper said, they make an aggregate confusion. So they take different data points. They might have even a security human rights data point or any other labor security data point. And then everything gets aggregated, and in the end you say, yeah, the company is quite okay, or it's bad. And that's complete nonsense. It's utter nonsense. And why do rating companies do that? Because they're savvy businesses, because they know that the investors, at least in the old times, it was super convenient to have one metric. And then everything is the same. Of course, with the exception, UBS never did that. But in principle, everything was the same. So you said, okay, you have 600 stocks you can invest in Europe. Let's now just say the 300 better ones, these are now the ESG stocks, and you don't really care how you came to this conclusion, take an ESG rating, and now you do exactly the same investment process. And if you believe in the portfolio theory, actually 300 stocks are still enough, it doesn't really make a difference, so you don't really consider ESG. So the reason is ESG ratings exist is for this very reason. So let's stop doing that. Let's not use ESG ratings, but let's look at specific things. And one of the specific things is this climate transition that we're supposed to do. But here, why do I disagree with The Economist? I think it's not the job of security companies, or not even of investors, to push for the climate transition. if we want to have a climate transition and have a better future, I think all of us want us, we as people and we as voters and governments and regulators must take that job. That's not the job of security companies. Forget about this climate question. That's the wrong conclusion from The Economist. ESG focusing on investors can hardly do anything good for climate. But, and here comes now the interesting part.
You have 15 seconds.
15 seconds left. You must not focus on ESG, but basically you must stop with this aggregation and should focus on things that matter. What matters, for example, is human rights. And then you should talk as an investor to a security company or to a buyer that buys security services and say, how do you deal specifically, for example, what I learned today, with pay of your security guards? So this is a way to make it meaningful.
I think that's a really good new article, right? Focus on the S and not the E. Great. Thank you, Philipp.
I did not really say that as I make
That's
it meaningful.
okay. That's what I said. Pranoti, you got some questions about how to ensure that it's really entrenched into the organization. How did you do it? Yeah.
How did we do it? First, step one, hire a Pranoti. No, I think, look, well, we'll have to talk. I'm a hard negotiator. Look, I think what I'd say is two things, right? First of all, Liam, to your question, I think you have to be able to articulate exactly what you mean when you say that I'm delivering good human rights in security services, right? This is what good looks like. This is step one, right? You have to be able to articulate within your organization. And where does that good sit within the trade-offs that exist on the spectrum of overall sustainability, right? I think for me, it's very, very clear what PMI sustainability priorities are. It's very clear to me what Philip Morris is going after when we talk about our sustainability targets, right? So there's a lot of clarity at the top of our organization in terms of what good looks like for sustainability, right? And I think that has a trickle-down effect across various steps in the value chain, right? Then I understand what good sustainable living wage looks like. I understand what, the quality of security services is something that is a contributor to that matters, right? And then also I think on the flip side of that, with security service provider companies, my conversation is also then between the percentage of the wage that's going to the security guard versus the margin that's being paid out to the security service provider, right? And I think that is a conversation that exists on a sliding scale. You know, am I going to be married to this same position in 5 years' time? No, probably not, right? It will be the human rights and sustainability position that is appropriate for that period in time, that marries up with the appetite, the sustainability appetite of the organization, and that matches the reality of the operating conditions on the ground, right? I think that also just quickly goes into the point around measurement, right? What happens very often is that there's a difference between what indicators are being measured by, I don't know, asset management companies. I'm not an investor relations person, but I am a practitioner. And as a doer, I know what good looks like, and I can articulate and measure that, right? The problem is that by the time it goes up into those aggregated metrics, my metric has disappeared, right? So actually looking at that ground level metric is probably more useful.
I think this sounds like a good lunch conversation, don't you? Like defining good. You said 5 years. How long have you been where you are now? So thank you, Pranoti, for sharing that. James, there was a little bit on the ground perspective in one of the last questions, I think.
Yeah, I'm actually going to try to link a few of these together because there was some points which in
90
my
seconds.
head
Go ahead.
were linked. Right, here we go. So B Corp, first of all, I do think that's useful. I think with those certification bodies who go in further detail than self-declaration does, looking under the hood of organisations, I think that is useful. The challenge is where they create a two-tier system. So essentially you're attracting good companies in the first place and companies that have a good story to tell, and you're not capturing necessarily those companies that need to be lifted up and need support. And that, I think, links to the tick box approach on the ground in terms of what can you do other than audits. We spend a lot of time building capacity with suppliers of organisations, be that training, be that supplementing some of their teams to really comply with even the basics of labour laws, for example. some of these third, fourth tier suppliers really struggle with things like that. So you can imagine the impacts that that creates. So I would say capacity building is such a key one. Turning to data, I agree with what's been said by Philipp in terms of ratings agencies have their place, for sure. But I would say that due diligence is more meaningful. And a case study to support that is the fast fashion company Boohoo in the UK, who was given a AA rating by MSCI.
50 seconds.
But yet had forced labour issues within their UK supply chain. So something's not right there. But that's not why ratings agencies exist and ratings data exists. But it is why due diligence exists.
Thank you, James. And now over to Elora. Elora, I'm sure you have chosen your question by now.
Sure. So I actually wanted to a little bit talk about this tick the box concept, because I think it really ties into what we're seeing in the communications of our different clients, that they are, let's say, bringing in sometimes very fancy sustainability reports, some metrics, some numbers, because numbers are easy to understand. That's what is the benefit of having these simple metrics, as you were saying. But at the same time, what we're missing, and this is what we were discussing, James, as well earlier, is the idea of the human impact assessments. So, for example, when you go out into the field and you have those conversations and you get perspective that is the real scenario of what is happening out there, very oftentimes that perspective is lost on the way to the official communication or the official statement and that voice. So I think this is something that would be really important to bring over the authenticity of getting away from a tick-the-box kind of an exercise.
Thank you, Elora. Thank you. Christian, last but not least.
Okay, number one, I think a lot of people have fallen into the trap of my beloved Economist, by being, provoked by what they write. Well, that's their job. That's why they're a good magazine. Number two, yes, E is simpler than S. You can break down 6 greenhouse gases into one, which is CO2, CO2, CO2. Try to do that with human rights. Bit difficult. So, clearly, if you look at it from a sort of quantitative and investor perspective, climate is the much easier proposition. It's not easy, but it's the easier proposition. So there is, in the end, some truth in the provocation. Thirdly, S is, sorry, I've almost said a word, starts with a B and ends with a Y, complex, which it is, because you can have in S everything from health, education, human rights, DEI, etc., etc. By the way, human rights, on that note, in contrast to climate, is only ever used in terms of risk. It's never used in terms of opportunities. Have you ever heard anybody talking about human rights in terms of opportunities? They do with climate. If people talk about opportunities in the human rights space, at least in the financial sector, they talk about health-related products, education-related products. They use the definite term of whatever is relevant here. So I think that's also an interesting distinction. 4, compliance versus ambition. Any company should still have an ambition. That's called strategy. Yes, you need to be compliant, but if you don't have an ambition, then forget about your company. That's a pretty tricky one. And 5, clearly there is divergence of regulation, and it's just going to get worse, and companies have to deal with that. There are now 16 plus sustainable finance taxonomies, and we don't have the social ones yet, ranging from the EU to Mongolia. So just take your pick, And finally, the voice of people. Tricky one. In one way, actually, when I think it's today, according to Democracy House or whatever the organization is called, 13% of countries in the world live in true liberal democracies. 13% of the countries, 9% of the people.
Thank you, Christian. Right, we now have 7 minutes to go, and I'm going to give the panel and the audience a task of 2 minutes. Your task is going to be to think of a 20-second answer to the following question. What next? How do we what are you going to do? What are we going to do? What do we need to do in order to get this more onto the agenda of people like your colleagues, Christian, onto the agenda of investors and ESG ratings? Your task is going to be a little bit of the same. My question to you is, you've now come across these 6 individuals who've given you something. We've given you some perspective, some thoughts, something. So what is it that you are taking with you today in terms of insight, in terms of thought, perspective, that you might carry with you in going forward and pushing this further so that we can improve the way that investors and clients can work with these topics? Okay, so you can sit, contemplate by yourself if you want, or you can talk to the person next to you. 2 minutes.
And I should have said the vote of the people rather than the voice of the people, because that really gets me. You know, how many people in the world, 9% of the people that live in true liberal democracies, so how many people are actually allowed to vote on the very topics, you know, properly and frequently, and transparently and freely, you know, on the topics that we're talking about? I mean, my afterthought with that one is, of course, that's why governments are putting more pressure on companies, very simply. Because that's the way that they can reach those areas of the world where you can't reach it through your normal democratic processes. It's just an unfortunately and sad truth. Oh no, I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about, James, is when you just check when people use the word human rights, they always ever use it.
Okay, everyone. I started standing up, so I'm going to end standing up. Can you believe that 2 minutes is already done? Okay. So I am going to ask for a bit of a popcorn style of takeaways. And I will say, so we don't have to run around with a microphone. So tell me something, a popcorn of what you're bringing with you from today. Something, a word, 2 words. Let's hear. What are you taking with you? Hopefully something. Anything. Multidimensional. Okay, thank you. More. Yes. Worker welfare at the heart of human rights, also for security providers. I'm filling in there. Yes. Governance. 3 words. Yep. Clear. Thank you. More. Yes. Be an effective negotiator. Pranoti, I can see that coming from you. Great. More. Yes. Supply chain. To think of security providers as part of the supply chain. All right, very good, thank you. Yes?
Killing off the tick box culture.
Killing the tick box culture, yes. Very good. And one more here?
Clients of private security companies.
Clients of private security, yes, definitely. And last popcorn, anyone?
Making a difference on the ground.
Making a difference on the ground. Isn't that a great ending? Okay, so Christian, we'll start from your side. 20 seconds. I know this is very hard, but let's go. One thing.
Okay, it's got to be on the governance theme. So your next board session, ask the board, if you were in 2030, which questions would you ask now?
Very good. Ask the board. Thank you. Elora.
Okay. I would say that every time you sit down to have a communication or to do something that will be externally facing, ask yourself from whose perspective are you saying it?
Perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo the supply chain comment and encourage everybody to think about their role within your own client's supply chain and how you can best demonstrate that you have the S fully covered as part of that.
Thank you very much, James. Pranoti?
I think for me, the best human rights outcomes occur when we approach things from the perspective of building a partnership. They're not dictated to anybody.
Partnership, thank you.
So make ESG meaningful by disaggregating it and looking, for example, at human rights data points.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's now 12:45. I only have one remaining question, and that is, ICoCA is not just doing this because ICoCA wants to describe the current play, but we want to move forward, right? We want to push this onto the agenda of the investor, of rating institutes, etc. So ICoCA is on the process of now going to develop this guide together with all of us. Are you going to join us? Are you going to help us? Raise your hand. Let's try again. Are you going to help us? Come on. I don't accept any hands down. Come on. Exercise. All right. We have a commitment. Thank you, everyone, for doing this. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the panel. Give ourselves an applause. Thank you.